Hey everyone, Thomas from Medieval Review here, and I am joined by none other than Chris Schweizer, who is a comic book artist, historical author, and I think just general fancier of swords, and I think all things swashbuckling as well. And he recently had a very successful Kickstarter get funded to do a project called A Dream of Swords. And so, Chris, thank you for joining me. And I really appreciate you taking the time. And I've got a slew of questions I'd like to ask you. But before I do that, if you want to kind of introduce yourself in any additional capacity, please, by all means.
Well, sure. Thank you so much, Thomas. I appreciate your bringing me on the show. I had COVID a couple of weeks ago, so my voice may at times skew towards the raspy. Uh, but other than that, I'm in good shape. I live in rural Western Kentucky. I'm in what's called the Western Coalfields region, and yeah, I just was really over the moon by the reception that the Dream of Swords book had, and the reach that it seemed to have. It far out exceeded my expectations for what was a niche little art book project. I haven't done Kickstarters for that sort of thing before. Usually I'll print up a couple hundred and take them to shows or put them for sale online or that sort of thing. And I thought, well, I might try it and see how it worked, and it worked really well. So that's very exciting because it allows me to expand the scope of the project a little bit.
Yeah, and it's not your first Kickstarter, right? You actually had a previous one that was Sherlock Holmes, I believe.
I did, yeah, and that was all wooden figures, these little wooden stand-ups based on characters from the Sherlock Holmes stories. So I think there were about 40 of them. And yeah, I did that a few years ago, and that's a very different animal from trying to do a print project. A book is accepting its content, which takes a while to produce. A book is fairly easy to produce, whereas it was a lot. There's image transfer, there's cutting, there's packaging, there's doing all the rest of it. And so that one, I doubt I made any money on it. I think I try to price things I'm a cheapskate, and so I don't want anyone else to have to pay more for something than I would be willing to pay, and so I tend to price things as low as I can. Um, and as a result of that, sometimes those profit margins are pretty skinny. And that the Sherlock Holmes thing was one such instance. So, and that one did fine as well. I think it doubled its goal, but this one went 20 times its goal, so and more. So that was really unexpected.
Did you have any learnings from that first Kickstarter that kind of helped inform
Absolutely.
this new one?
The biggest one is that shipping costs contribute to your how much is considered raised if you include the shipping costs in there. And so if I know exactly how much a book is going to cost to print, or how much it's going, to do a run, or how much it's going to cost to do a run if it's hardcover or if it has an embossment, those numbers can be skewed dramatically if the shipping costs are included in there. Because if you have three people shipping to South Africa, all of a sudden you have an extra $100 or $150 on the thing just because shipping costs are so much. And it makes it to where you don't exactly know whether or not you have the capital funds to finance the book. And so I found out you are able to charge shipping separately after the campaign. And once I figured that out, that made it to where it was much easier to quantify how much I actually needed in order to make these stretch goals. And so, what stretch goals are, if anybody doesn't necessarily know, is that with Kickstarter, you're pre-funding a project, and you have your goal for how much it's going to cost to do that project, and then you can have these stretch goals that say, well, if I make $2,000 more than that, then that means that this book, which was going to be paperback, now can be hardcover, and everybody gets a hardcover instead of a paperback. So it incentivizes people to proselytize about the project, to tell their friends about it and things like that, because the more money that it raises, the better the book that they're getting for the same cost. So they're paying $16, but now it's a hardcover book. It comes with a zine, it comes with a field book, it comes with bookmarks, it comes with an extra 25 drawings, all this stuff, because they spread that word of mouth and because it kept bringing in enough money to finance those things.
So, I want to talk about A Dream of Swords, and we will
Mhm,
get into that. I do also want to talk a little bit about some of your past work and some of
mhm,
how you've done kind of historical, things before. You're an author of quite a few things. You, did, Roanoke Colony, America's First Mystery. You've done a book series called The Creeps, a one called The Krogans. I believe The Krogans is more historical fiction as well.
mhm.
Um, you're also just a general artist, and I think that's an important thing to note. You've done collaborative work where you've done art. The two that really stood out to me is Squirrel Girl, which I think is pretty popular within the Marvel crowd, and Mars Attacks as well, as I understand it. Right?
Yeah, the Squirrel Girl is effectively not me at all. My friend Erica was the artist on that series and is a fantastic artist. And every once in a while, for various reasons, she'd have somebody else come in and draw a specific panel, either for a flashback scene or graphic design or something. So I think I did like two panels in Squirrel Girl. So I don't really count that as a credit. I haven't done a, you know, I've done, I think I've done work for every other major comics publisher, but I don't really count having done anything for Marvel because, although, I'm credited in the books, but I didn't draw the book. But Mars Attacks was a lot of fun. That one came up because my best friend and frequent collaborator Kyle Starks, he's a cartoonist, but he's mostly known these days for being a comic writer. The difference being that a comic artist draws comics that other people write, a comic writer writes comics that other people draw, and a cartoonist draws comics that they have written themselves. So Kyle does that sometimes, and that's how I first discovered his work, and it's what we bonded over. But he nowadays he writes a lot of stuff for DC, for Dark Horse, for Marvel, for whoever. So he's done like Peacemaker, he's done Lobo, all kinds of stuff. But he got asked if he'd be interested in doing Mars Attacks, and he told me, he was like, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing this Mars Attacks book," and I said, "Oh, that sounds fun. Who's drawing it?" And he said, "I don't know." And I said, "Well, I'll draw it." And he said, "That's not how it works, Chris." Um, I said, "Who's the editor?" And he said, and so we asked the editor, and the editor was like, "Yeah, we'd love for you to draw it." And I said, "Okay." So I tend to like haplessly fall into projects in ways that aren't necessarily there, but that one, we had to do it really fast. And basically what we were doing, and Kyle's idea for it was to take the original card set from the mid-century, and treat the things that happen as a chronology, and because they sort of are a chronology in there. It's like Congress gets destroyed,
Yeah,
this
there's like a
bridge gets
story in the
destroyed, here's this thing.
background, right?
Yeah, and use that as the framework for a more human story in which this um, elderly dad and his middle-aged fail son are sort of like trying to get to safety while all of these things are happening around him. So it was a lot of fun getting to play with that structurally. And getting to work at a pace much quicker than my usual thing. I was juggling that on top of another project. I wanted to do it. They wanted it to be out by Halloween. And so I think I drew and colored and lettered the first two issues in, I think, about 3.5 weeks altogether for both of them. So it was a really fast job, but it's still some of, I think, my best work, despite the fact that some other issues will take me 4 months. I'm a time goldfish. I take the amount of time that I have to do a project, and so when you give me a tight deadline, I do the tight deadline.
I was really appreciating the kind of poster version of your Mars Tech artwork because it's such a striking visual thing, right? Going all the way back to the cards. Um, and I actually one of my favorite things is its sister cards that actually have a complete collection of dinosaurs attacks.
Oh, those are amazing! I wish that they do a comic or something in that vein. I think that would be a whole lot of fun.
Yeah, yeah, I do too. And anyway, I saw that and I was like, oh, really excited. I do also want to talk a bit about
Oh, but
kinda your
but
oh, good.
before you do that, I'm so sorry. Going back, yeah, you also mentioned the Krogan Adventures. That was my first series, and they were a series of graphic novels that I did. The first one I did while I was still in grad school, and it's the first one's the premise of that one, or the conceit of it, was that each book opens with a dad telling his kids about their ancestors, and so it allowed a framework for me to change genres and historical eras with each book. So the first book was pirates. The second book was the French Foreign Legion. Third was the Western Frontier campaign or theater of the American Revolution. And in theory, I was going to keep doing those until I died, but the publisher paid very, very little, and I wasn't able to make that sustainable as a job. Um, but it was great because it really sort of, as I came into the industry and into publishing, it cemented really the type of project that I'm most interested in doing, and that the historical stuff tends to be what I'm most hired for when people are looking for a particular project, and for that I'm very grateful.
And I'm gonna go ahead and show it, on my camera here because I actually have a copy of this book. And I have a very specific question for you. I do wanna talk a
Yeah.
bit about the book because it speaks a little bit to kind of your interest in researching history as
Mhm.
well. But specifically, I have a very specific question. Page 18, you have a flattened woodpecker. What's that
Yes.
about?
He's it's just a thing, I was reading John White's descriptions and looking at his illustrations. He was the first governor of Roanoke. Or he wasn't the first guy. He was the last governor of Roanoke, excuse me. And But he did all these wonderful watercolor paintings of some of the Secatan villages and the different people, and that was one of the sort of badges of office for one of the holy men, is that they'd have these woodpecker carcasses that were hammered flat and put in the head. And I just thought, you got, especially when you're doing a book that's going to be read by kids, some of the weird and macabre stuff you really want to highlight. And my favorite two things with presenting history are sort of very opposite ends of the spectrum. One is that people don't, that the human condition remains consistent, that people were saying and thinking and doing the same things 4,000 years ago as they do now. And I think there's something really exciting about that. And when you're talking to kids, especially, I'll bring up, some quotes from some of the ancients about how, kids today don't respect their elders and they spend too much time on their tablets, uh, etc. And cite when that's from. And so that's one aspect. But the other aspect, and the flattened woodpecker, I think, sort of falls into this category, is when you showcase sort of the shocking disconnect between the past and the present, and the things that we now look at as absolutely wild and weird. And there's also a little bit of danger doing that, because once you contextualize those things within the framework of the society that they're in, the culture and the time and things along those lines, they are far less weird and ridiculous. And that's especially true with military history stuff. I mean, as a kid, you get the sense that line warfare and the colonial thing was just a bunch of people being idiots, as opposed, and not knowing to duck. Versus the mechanics of how that works best for the technology that's there. And so there is sort of a, the danger of sort of falling into that horrible histories. Look how foolish people were in the past, because everybody's generally, not everybody, some people are always awful, but most people are generally doing the best they can, are generally informed as to what their abilities are at the time, and sort of try to operate through that sense. But that said, kids still love seeing a flattened woodpecker on somebody's head.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of there being a cultural kind of disconnect, that's a big theme, right? It's a big theme in this book, is kind of, both the cultural disconnect as well as the potential cultural blending eventually. Um, yeah, so that's I was just very curious about that one because it didn't really have a lot of context around it. Okay, so uh, I have tons of questions for you. I will note I've been kind of looking into a lot of stuff you've been doing. I've seen your current work doing the Swashtober art. You got Inigo Montoya in there recently, so that's been really a lot of fun to look at, and kind of just kind of looking at the breadth of your knowledge and things that you seem to be very interested in seems to suggest that you like a lot of kind of called the Errol Flynn era of swashbuckling adventures. Um, but obviously, you have an interest and a passion in swords, which is, surprise, surprise, a big topic of my channel. And I don't spend a lot of time on Kickstarter. I actually had a friend who messaged me the Kickstarter, and I saw it and was immediately like, "Oh no, this is amazing!" Right? Um, beautiful way of capturing swords in a style of art that is, I mean, honestly, I don't really think that these two things really cross over all that much, right? You tend to either get photos of museum pieces, or I would say hyper realistic sketches if there are any. But you're doing both realistic but a comic style, and I think it's absolutely amazing. And that's part of what made me really excited to see the Kickstarter and then want to talk to you. Um, so let's talk a little bit about the art itself that's going to be in this art book. First of all, just kind of tell us how you got started on this project, and what your inspiration was for it.
Well, I like doing, and I've been doing this since I started doing the historical things. So for I started doing or I started pursuing comics as a career. Went to school for it, that sort of thing, in 2006, I think. Yeah, 2006. And So ever since I've been doing that, anytime I'm in a town with museums, I go to the museums, and a lot of times I will sketch the things there, because I found that if you're looking at clothing, if you're looking at accoutrements, if you're looking at especially armor, things along those lines, it can be very difficult to parse exactly how it works when looking at a photograph. And so the more that I can kind of look at something and turn my head and see, oh, okay, well, this is how this rivet connects. This goes into this part. It doesn't overlap, like that kind of thing. It really makes it to where then when I sit down to draw it, I can draw it much better. And especially if I'm trying to do something where it's getting practical use in a story, somebody's moving around wearing armor, somebody's moving around wearing a bandolier, I'm going to draw it better. And so I've been doing sketches in museums for a long time. And then once I started watercoloring and applying watercolors to my sketches, um, I found that one, they got a little bit prettier, and two, people wanted to buy them. And so I started doing that more. And what had been sort of strictly ugly art that was designed solely to help me understand things became more finished pieces that I could share. And part of that is, social media. Part of it is printing stuff in art books. Part of it is the commercial reality of needing to make money from every source that I can in order to finance a comfortable lifestyle as a guy who mostly draws comics about history, which is a pretty niche field. And so I started doing that kind of thing, and I got to where I was thinking, well, I'd love to be able to do more than I can generally do. It takes me a little while to do it. Mixing paints on the fly is kind of tough. And I thought, well, what if I did just, I really like this indigo paint that I have. And here I've got some of the originals here. So I really like this indigo paint that I have, and it allows me to do value really well. And so I can take um, a drawing and do this sort of indigo wash on it and get the sense of darks and lights that I want, that help to communicate what the sword looks like, but also doesn't take as long. I don't have to mix any paint. I just have to mix it with water to get the lights and darks that I need. And so we were in the UK because my daughter, who was 13 at the time, she's about to turn 15, um, was in a harp competition. She plays the harp, and so we were in Wales for this, and we were close enough to Leeds. I knew the Royal Armoury was there. I knew that one of the shops that sponsors a comics uh, festival called Thought Bubble was there, and so I thought, well, I'll set up a signing at the comic shop there, Traveling Man. And while I'm there, I will go to the Leeds Armory, the Royal Armories, and do some sketches. I'd been there before a couple of times. I hadn't been there since I was in college, and so I thought, well, I'd definitely love to go back and do some sketches and take some pictures. And so I started doing these sketches while I was there and doing them in this format where I have a close up of the hilt, and then a sort of a longer view shot that shows the entire sword sort of from a straight angle. So the same way that you'd see them photographed in a book. Um, but the attempt with the hilt was to try. I think that photographs sometimes can be tricky to parse, and when you're drawing something, it's easier to show, well, this part is in front of this part, this part is in front of this part, and you kind of fudge reality just a smidge in order to service clarity. And I think that's one of the things that a drawing of a sword can sometimes have an edge over a photograph of a sword. And so I was really enjoying doing these. I did quite a few over the course of a couple of days. And I'm blanking on his last name, Sorlakis. But there's a one of the curators of Edged Weapons, Iason, um, came to my signing and told me that he was a curator of Edged Weapons and asked if I wanted to come back the next day and get sort of a behind the scenes thing. And I was like, absolutely. So I put off my return to Wales and came in and did kind of had like a little guided curated exhibit, which was fantastic, and was able to do some more sketches. And so I had quite a few by the time I got back to Wales, and then we went to London, to the British Museum, and I did quite a few there. And so I ended up having probably about um 30 drawings or thereabouts. And so then I had another opportunity to do a trip to Paris earlier this year, and so I did a whole lot more there at the Army Museum. And before long, I had, enough that I thought, well, I need to put these together in a book. And so that sort of, and since then, we went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which has a great arms and armory collection, and a few other like tidbits where I'd go to a museum that had, two swords, and I'd do those two swords. And so that's sort of how it started. And I thought, well, I'd love to collect these into a book. And because they were done monotone, I could do it black and white. It would be very cheap. And so the idea of sort of self-publishing this, versus going through a publisher like I do with my comics work, was very appealing to me. And I thought it would be a really fun project.
And, with the success of the Kickstarter, I believe you're actually not gonna be black and white, it's actually gonna be full
Mhm.
color, correct? So
Yeah.
we'll actually get to see the indigo in that
Yeah,
color
so
range.
it's actually two color, which I'm in the process of learning how to prepare the files for that. So it will have the indigo and the black and gray. But one of the things that's kind of that I'm having a little bit of trickiness with, but I'm excited about, is that I did, again, because I was thinking these were going to be in black and white. I didn't have an indigo pin, so I had some gray pins that I made out of other pins. I'm always kind of tweaking my tools. And so like the Ray skin on this day show here, is in gray. And rather than have everything sort of be tinted indigo, I'd really like to be able to preserve where the gray line art intersects with the indigo and that sort of thing. So I'm fiddling with that. But yeah, they'll look as close to the originals as possible. And one of the backer goals for the Kickstarter were the originals. So I'll have about 105 originals, I think, that'll be going out to the backers. So people who got the sword book, some of them will also get the physical art that was used to make the drawings in that are in the sword book.
Amazing. So, you've seen a lot of swords. I think I know the answer to this question, but I'll let you answer it. What's your favorite type of sword?
Oh, that's tough. They're two, and they're sort of opposite ends of the spectrum, although they're roughly concurrent date wise. I am. Swiss. I mean, I'm American, but my family is Swiss. My grandfather was Swiss, and we celebrated Swiss Independence Day growing up. So we've got a lot of uh, Zweihander and halberd reverence in the family. It ends up in a lot of iconography of wedding invitations and things along those lines. So and I'll also, I'm a big fella, so I like a Zweihander. I do really like uh, sort of a early 17th century rapier a lot. The really long ones, just because. Partially because those were the movies that I most liked growing. I liked Zorro, I liked Three Musketeers, that kind of thing. And we used variations on that. My dad ran an opera company when I was a kid, and I would help him choreograph any of the fight scenes that would be in there. And anytime there was an opportunity for a sword fight scene, he'd put a sword fight scene in there. And so we would have fencing foils or stage rapiers or things along those lines, and I always enjoyed fiddling around with those as a kid, and so those have a special place in my heart. But probably, just a an enormous Zweihander with all the fiddly bits. I think the more ornate, the better. I think that kind of speaks to me at a primal level.
All right. So you said you have well over 100 of these art pieces that you've created that will be in the book. I think is every single one of them going to be in the book? Because I think there are some that were not. Is that correct?
I think all of them are going to the only ones that won't be in the book. There's going to be a print set for swords that I have to make up, which is three uh, mythic swords. So Excalibur, Grasscutter, and Narsil. And so I will design what I think those should look like based on I mean Narsil just not based on his history, but I what I think should be the distance between the era in which it's set and the era in which it was made. But Excalibur and Grasscutter sort of borrowing heavily from swords of those eras. So those won't be in the book, but everything else will be in the book. There were a few early on that I did, that like some halberds and some poleaxes, that won't be in the book just because they're not swords. Before I had figured out that it was going to be a sword book. So some of those leads pieces won't, but almost everything else will be. And I'm going to, one of the stretch goals, well, two of the stretch goals were to do additional swords and travel. So one was to travel up to Cleveland to their armory collection. And so I did that and did another 10 drawings up there. And then my wife and I are going to Vienna at the end of November to do the last 15 or more. I have to lay out the book, and if I have more space for additional swords, I'll do as many as I have pages. So I'm looking forward to that. So not all of them are done yet. There's still another at least 15 to be done. But I don't want to do them from photographs or other people's photographs. I want to be in person. I want to be able to look at them. I want to be able to get the angle that best I think suits the drawing, which is sometimes tricky from photos. And so yeah, it's indulgent to be like, I'm gonna go to Vienna to do this last bit, but I mean, it's also very exciting. There's two armory museums very close together. There's the Imperial Armory in Vienna, and there's the Graz Armory. And so I'm very excited to look at both, because I think that both uh, I don't get a chance to look at Zweihanders very much around here, so I'm very excited to see some you know big Renaissance Alpine stuff.
So of all of the ones that you've sketched up and you've drawn and you've painted and that you've seen in person, were there any that really stood out to you in a unique way?
Some of the I'm trying to remember what the names of them were. There were some 18th, 19th century sort of Baltic swords that had these really intricate, almost machined designs with all these stones built into them. That had very unusual hilt shapes. They weren't like that Turkish one with the ears. It was something I hadn't ever seen before. I thought those were really interesting. They kind of looked like, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but if you ever go into World Market and see the mom jewelry, it kind of, or at this point, grandmom jewelry. I'm thinking mom jewelry from like 20 years ago. It kind of had that vibe to it, where it had these like big bright orange stones or teal stones or things along those lines, and I thought those were really neat. Uh, One of the things that always surprises me looking at any of these is, even going back, as far as ancient stuff, the degree of fine detail that's in everything is just absolutely staggering. And even some of the more workmanlike pieces have just an absolute artistry to them, and sort of these sharp angles that it's very easy to look at craftsmanship as being a progressive and linear thing. And as we get more finer tools and finer materials and more control over metallurgy, we're able to do better work than was done whenever. And just seeing them in person just reminds you that that's not the case. That, the just the intricacy of the wire work and the engraving and the just how things are connected, and it's just absolutely staggering to me. um so I mean, just in general, I mean, every single one kind of, I know that sounds silly, but almost every sword that you look at, with very rare exception, something about it jumps out at you as being just majestic or interesting or gorgeous or otherwise arresting, which it was part of what propelled me to keep doing these drawings. Every single one was a little bit of a revelation for me in some way or another. I hope that doesn't sound like a dodge.
No, no, and I think, anyone who appreciates swords, especially from, like, even an artistic standpoint, more so than from a martial standpoint, we tend to agree, right? Alright, so, you have a background, at least in part, in doing historical comics that, again, this book, right, seeks to inform the reader as well as entertain them. Since A Dream of Swords is going to be an art book, and you're really only communicating through a visual medium here, no written words really, except for a forward that will be in it. Is there anything that you want people to learn from the book through what you're imparting visually, and what is that? What are you trying to convey beyond just the imagery?
You know, I am not. I'm not really sure. I think one of the things that I tend to have a habit of doing is being awfully pedantic with most historical art that I post. I tend to post a lot of things online, and they're almost always accompanied by an essay. If I post a biography of somebody, or excuse me, if I post a portrait of somebody that I draw, a historical figure, it almost always comes with a 15 tweet thread accompanying it, or a few paragraphs on whatever platform that I'm doing. And something that I think would probably be better for me as an artist, and as somebody who's sharing some historical stuff, is, each drawing has a little bit of info on it, and that's kind of it. And I think that the visual may be enough in this case. I'm trying to battle against my natural urges to write a really, really lengthy appendix. Partially because a lot of these are swords that I don't know much about and that I haven't been able to find out much about. Museums that tend to have a lot of documentation about their art sometimes will just say sword uh, next to a sword. It won't say what type of sword it is or anything along those lines. And so sometimes it's something that I don't recognize, and I've had to do a lot of additional research to try and figure out, like, did this have a particular name in the region that it's from? Like, should I be using that? And so a lot of stuff I don't know. There's some things that I know about. There's some things that I read about in the little placards, which is great. But I also think that there's some value in and again, this runs against my natural inclinations in letting people see something and think this is neat. I want to find out more about it, and allowing them to do that, and just to have it be a book of drawings. It's not something I've thought about very much in regards to this project, except so far as to how much to limit the appendix, and how honest to be with the appendix. Where I can say I know nothing about this sword, and not make it feel as though I'm shortchanging the audience, because that's a concern as well. Some folks do follow me because I present fun historical stuff, and I don't want to shortchange them.
Cool. Chris, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I'm really excited to see the book. For those who've missed out on the Kickstarter, I believe the plan is to eventually have this published and sellable as well once the Kickstarter process goes through its stuff, correct?
Yeah, so it will. I will. Right now, I'm scheduled to be getting the books in March and to have them sent out by the end of that. I've been talking with the printer and getting everything planned. Um, so that is the hope and the best case scenario. In which case, I will probably, once all of the Kickstarter backers have them in hand, I will make it commercially available, and that will probably be sometime in May. So I'm hoping that, again, assuming that everything goes according to plan, it'll be in May. But yeah, I do want to make them to where other folks who found out about it later are able to have it, that I can take it with me when I do. I don't do a whole lot of comic shows, but I'd like to be able to have it on hand when I do, things like that.
Amazing. Well, again, Chris, thank you for taking the time to talk to me. I greatly appreciate it. Really looking forward to it. For everyone else, again, that's a Dream of Swords, the art book by Chris Schweizer. And thank you again so much for joining me, Chris.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me, Thomas.